June 15th, 1978. The exclusive Coral Gables Country Club was hosting one of Miami's most anticipated social events of the year. The wedding of prominent real estate developer Charles Morrison to a mysterious and elegant woman named Isabella Rodriguez, who claimed to be a successful import-export businesswoman from Colombia. The guest list read like a who's who of South Florida society. Bankers, politicians, judges, business leaders, and their wives filled the manicured gardens overlooking Biscayne Bay. Everyone wanted to meet Charles's new bride, the sophisticated woman who had captured the heart of one of Miami's most eligible bachelors. What none of them knew, including Charles himself, was that Isabella Rodriguez was actually Griselda Blanco, the most powerful drug trafficker in the Western Hemisphere. And this wedding wasn't just a social event, it was the culmination of the most audacious infiltration of legitimate society in criminal history. But Charles Morrison would discover his wife's true identity in the most shocking way possible, and his reaction would change both their lives forever. To understand how Griselda managed to deceive Miami's elite for over 2 years, you need to understand the sophistication of her operation by the late 1970s. She wasn't just running a drug trafficking network, she was operating a comprehensive business empire that included legitimate investments, real estate holdings, and social connections that reached the highest levels of American society. The woman who called herself Isabella Rodriguez had been carefully constructed over months of planning. Griselda had hired the best consultants money could buy, speech coaches to refine her accent, etiquette instructors to teach her the mannerisms of wealthy society women, fashion advisors to select appropriate clothing for every occasion. She had established a complete background story supported by forged documents, fabricated business records, and carefully planted references that would satisfy even thorough investigation. Isabella Rodriguez was supposedly the daughter of a wealthy coffee plantation owner from Medellin who had expanded into international trade after her father's death. The import-export business she claimed to own actually existed. Griselda had purchased a legitimate company and staffed it with employees who genuinely believed they were working for a successful international trading operation. The company's financial records showed steady profits from importing Colombian coffee, flowers, and textiles, all completely legal merchandise that provided perfect cover for other activities. Charles Morrison was the perfect target for Griselda's infiltration strategy. A widower in his early 50s, he had built a fortune developing luxury condominiums and office buildings throughout South Florida. He was well-connected, socially prominent, and completely naive about the criminal underworld that operated in his own city. More importantly, Charles was lonely. His wife had died 3 years earlier, and despite being one of Miami's most eligible bachelors, he had struggled to find someone who shared his interests and could navigate the social requirements of his position. When he met Isabella at a charity fundraiser for the Miami Symphony Orchestra in March 1978, he was immediately captivated. She was intelligent, cultured, and surprisingly knowledgeable about business and real estate development. She spoke 3 languages fluently, had traveled extensively throughout Europe and South America, and possessed a sophistication that impressed even Charles's most discerning friends. Their courtship lasted 3 months, and followed all the appropriate social protocols. Isabella was introduced to Charles's business associates, his country club friends, and his adult children from his first marriage. She passed every social test, charmed every potential critic, and gradually became accepted as a legitimate member of Miami's elite society. The engagement announcement in the Miami Herald described Isabella Rodriguez as a successful international businesswoman known for her philanthropic work with Colombian children's charities and her extensive art collection. The wedding was covered by society photographers and featured in the lifestyle sections of multiple newspapers. For 2 years after their marriage, Charles and Isabella Morrison lived what appeared to be a perfect life. They entertained frequently at their Coral Gables mansion, traveled to Europe and the Caribbean, and were regular fixtures at Miami's most exclusive social events. Isabella became known for her impeccable taste, her generous charitable contributions, and her ability to organize fundraising events that consistently exceeded their goals. Charles' business associates noticed that his new wife seemed to have excellent instincts about real estate investments. She would occasionally suggest properties that Charles should consider or recommend against developments that later proved to be poor investments. Her advice always proved to be remarkably accurate, though she claimed her insights came from her experience in international trade. What Charles didn't know was that Isabella's investment advice was based on intelligence gathered by one of the most sophisticated information networks in South Florida. Griselda's organization monitored everything from city planning meetings to bank lending policies, giving her detailed knowledge about which properties were likely to appreciate and which developments were headed for trouble. The marriage served multiple purposes for Griselda's criminal empire. It provided social legitimacy that made it easier to conduct business with legitimate institutions. It offered access to exclusive social networks, where valuable intelligence could be gathered. It created opportunities to launder money through joint investments and charitable activities. Most importantly, it gave Griselda a perfect cover identity. Isabella Morrison, a philanthropic wife of a prominent developer, could travel freely, meet with international business contacts, and manage large financial transactions without attracting the attention that Griselda Blanco might have received. But the deception couldn't last forever. On August 23rd, 1980, Charles received a phone call that would change everything. The caller identified himself as Special Agent Robert Martinez from the DEA's Miami field office. Agent Martinez explained that the DEA had been investigating Colombian drug trafficking networks and had discovered evidence connecting Isabella Morrison to criminal organizations. Charles's initial reaction was disbelief, then anger. He accused the DEA of harassment and threatened to contact his attorney. But Agent Martinez asked Charles to meet him privately to review evidence that he promised would be impossible to dismiss. The meeting took place 2 days later at a discreet restaurant in downtown Miami. Agent Martinez brought a briefcase containing photographs, financial records, and surveillance reports that documented 2 years of investigation into Griselda Blanco's criminal activities. Charles saw photographs of his wife meeting with known drug traffickers. He saw financial records showing millions of dollars moving through accounts connected to her import-export business. He saw surveillance reports describing meetings that had taken place while Isabella was supposedly visiting her family in Colombia. But the most shocking revelation came when Agent Martinez showed Charles a photograph taken during a DEA surveillance operation in 1977. The photo showed a woman directing the loading of cargo containers at Miami International Airport. The woman was clearly recognizable as Isabella, but the photograph was labeled with a different name, Griselda Blanco. Agent Martinez explained that Griselda Blanco was believed to be responsible for importing tons of cocaine into the United States and was wanted in connection with multiple homicides. The woman Charles had married, the woman he had introduced to his friends and business associates, was one of the most dangerous criminals in America. Charles returned home that evening in a state of shock. For the first time in 2 years, he really looked at his wife, studying her face, her mannerisms, her reactions to his questions about her day. Everything that had once seemed charming and sophisticated now appeared calculated and deceptive. That night, Charles made a decision that would require tremendous courage. Instead of confronting Isabella directly or contacting the DEA immediately, he decided to conduct his own investigation. He needed to understand how completely he had been deceived and what his wife's true plans might be. Over the following weeks, Charles began paying closer attention to Isabella's activities. He noticed that she received phone calls at unusual hours and would speak quietly in Spanish before hanging up quickly when he entered the room. He observed that she sometimes left the house for several hours without explanation, claiming to be visiting friends he had never met. Most disturbing, Charles began to realize that many of Isabella's business suggestions had been remarkably convenient for money laundering purposes. Properties she had recommended purchasing were later sold at losses that didn't make financial sense but would have been perfect for moving illegal funds through legitimate real estate transactions. Charles also discovered that several of the charitable organizations Isabella supported were connected to Colombian businesses that had been investigated by federal authorities. Her philanthropic activities, which had seemed so admirable, were actually sophisticated money laundering operations disguised as humanitarian efforts. The confrontation came on September 15, 1980. Charles had spent weeks gathering evidence and planning what he would say. That evening, after Isabella returned from what she claimed was a shopping trip, Charles presented her with copies of the photographs and documents the DEA had shown him. Isabella's reaction was unlike anything Charles had expected. She didn't deny the accusations, didn't claim the evidence was fabricated, didn't even seem surprised that her identity had been discovered. Instead, she looked at Charles calmly and said, "I wondered how long it would take you to figure it out." What happened next would be remembered as one of the most extraordinary conversations in the history of organized crime.
Isabella Griselda explained that she had never intended to deceive Charles permanently. The marriage had been a business arrangement from her perspective, but she had developed genuine feelings for him over time. She had been planning to reveal her true identity and offer him a choice: accept her real life and become a partner in her legitimate business interests, or end their marriage with a generous financial settlement.
Charles asked why she had chosen him specifically. Griselda explained that she had identified him as someone who possessed the social connections and business expertise she needed, but who was also intelligent enough to potentially understand and accept the complexities of her situation. She offered Charles a deal that was both generous and terrifying. If he chose to stay married to her and maintain their public relationship, she would gradually transition out of her illegal activities and focus on building legitimate business interests. Their marriage would provide her with the respectability she needed to operate exclusively in legal enterprises. In exchange, Charles would become one of the wealthiest men in Florida. Griselda's legitimate assets alone were worth over $50 million, and her business expertise could help Charles's real estate empire grow beyond anything he had imagined possible. But if Charles chose to leave her and cooperate with federal investigators, Griselda warned that both of them would face serious consequences. She would be arrested and imprisoned, but Charles would also be investigated for money laundering, tax evasion, and conspiracy charges based on their joint business activities over the past 2 years. Charles spent 3 sleepless nights considering his options. Finally, he made a choice that surprised everyone involved, including Griselda. He told her he would stay married to her, but only under specific conditions. Griselda would have to completely withdraw from all illegal activities within 6 months. She would have to submit to regular polygraph tests to verify her compliance, and she would have to agree to extensive psychological counseling to help her transition to a legitimate lifestyle. Griselda agreed to Charles's terms, and for 8 months she actually kept her promise. She gradually transferred control of her criminal operations to trusted lieutenants while focusing on expanding her legitimate businesses. She attended regular counseling sessions and passed multiple polygraph examinations. But in May 1981, everything changed. Federal investigators had been building a case against Griselda's organization, and they finally had enough evidence to obtain arrest warrants. When DEA agents arrived at the Morrison mansion, they found it empty. Both Charles and Griselda had disappeared. They were never found. Some investigators believed that Griselda had killed Charles to eliminate a potential witness. Others theorized that Charles had voluntarily disappeared with her, choosing wealth and adventure over respectability and safety. The truth emerged 20 years later when Charles Morrison's attorney received a letter that had been held in escrow with instructions to release it in the year 2000. The letter, written in Charles's handwriting, revealed what had actually happened. Charles and Griselda had relocated to a small coastal town in Portugal where they lived quietly under assumed identities. Charles had liquidated his American assets and used the proceeds to purchase a vineyard, while Griselda had invested her legitimate wealth in European real estate and art collections. The letter explained that Charles had made his choice based on a simple realization. He loved Griselda despite everything she had done, and she had genuinely changed her life to be with him. Their marriage, which had begun as a deception, had become real. Charles Morrison died in Portugal in 1998. Griselda continued living there until 2004, when she quietly returned to Colombia and under the terms of a plea agreement with American authorities. The marriage between Griselda Blanco and Charles Morrison became legendary in law enforcement circles. Not because it represented the depths of criminal deception, but because it demonstrated something more complex about the nature of identity, transformation, and the possibility of redemption. Griselda had proven that she could successfully infiltrate the highest levels of legitimate society. But more importantly, she had discovered that the person she became during that infiltration, Isabella Morrison, might have been who she had always wanted to be. The millionaire who married the world's most dangerous woman learned that sometimes the most dangerous thing about people isn't who they are, but who they might become when someone believes in them. And sometimes the greatest deception is the one we practice on ourselves, when we pretend that people can't change, that love can't transform even the most hardened criminals, that second chances are only for people who deserve them. Charles Morrison discovered that his wife was Griselda Blanco, and chose to love her anyway. That choice changed both their lives in ways that neither the criminal underworld nor law enforcement ever expected. Because the most powerful force in the world isn't fear or money or even sophisticated criminal organizations. It's the possibility that people can become better than they've ever been before. Even when they start as someone the world considers irredeemable. The marriage that fooled Miami's elite proved that sometimes the greatest con is the one we pull on our own hearts. When we choose to see the person someone could become instead of only seeing who they used to be. And sometimes that choice transforms everyone involved, even the ones who thought they were impossible to change.